Sometimes the hungriest people are the ones still giving food away. The wind dragged dust across the empty road as Wyatt Mercer pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and kept his horse moving through the fading light. The late winter sky over Wyoming looked cold enough to crack stone, pale gray clouds stretching across miles of silent land where abandoned fences leaned like tired old men. Dusty's hooves pressed slowly into the frozen dirt, each step heavy after nearly 20 miles without rest. Wyatt hadn't eaten since the morning before. The only thing left in his saddlebag was half a loaf of stale bread wrapped in cloth and a small strip of smoked beef he had been saving for the night. He kept one hand close to the bag as if protecting treasure. Out there, food was treasure. The wind howled through the broken remains of an old wagon near the roadside, and Wyatt barely glanced at it as he rode past. He had learned years ago that stopping for every strange sound in the West could leave a man robbed, stranded, or dead broke. So he kept riding. 1 second passed, then another. Dusty suddenly slowed on his own, ears twitching toward the wagon behind them. Wyatt frowned slightly and pulled the reins. At first he thought it was just the wind again, but then he heard it. Small, weak, barely louder than the air itself. Please, food. Wyatt closed his eyes for a moment. His jaw tightened beneath the rough stubble on his face. He looked down the road ahead instead of behind him. The nearest town was still at least 6 miles away. 6 cold miles. His stomach already felt hollow enough to ache. He could ignore it. Most men would. He nudged Dusty forward again, and the horse took 3 slow steps before Wyatt finally stopped. The silence afterward felt heavier than the wind. He exhaled sharply through his nose and turned the horse around. The wagon sat crooked beside the road, one wheel half buried in dirt, its faded canvas ripped apart by weather and time. Wyatt climbed down carefully, boots crunching against frozen ground. His right hand hovered near the holster at his side out of habit, though he doubted any outlaw would whisper like that. He stepped closer. You alone under there? No answer came at first. Then he heard soft movement. Wyatt crouched slightly and looked beneath the wagon. A little girl stared back at him from the shadows. Maybe 8 years old, maybe younger. Dirt covered her pale face so heavily he could barely tell her skin was white beneath it. Her blonde hair hung in tangled knots around hollow cheeks, and her blue eyes looked dull from exhaustion. She was curled tightly against the cold with her knees pressed to her chest beneath a threadbare brown blanket that looked too thin to survive the night. Wyatt noticed her hands first. Tiny, shaking badly. Not from fear, from hunger. The girl tried to sit up straighter when she saw him looking at her, but even that seemed difficult. I'm sorry, she whispered weakly. I didn't mean to beg. Wyatt said nothing for several seconds. He just looked at her. He had seen hungry people before. Too many. Men in mining camps. Families during drought years. Railroad workers sleeping beside tracks with empty stomachs. But there was something different about seeing a child trying to apologize for being hungry. Dusty snorted softly behind him while the wind carried dead leaves across the road. Wyatt finally spoke. Where's your family? The little girl lowered her eyes immediately. No answer. Wyatt studied her torn boots, noticing one lace tied with string instead of leather. He saw the dirt under her fingernails and the way her lips looked cracked from dehydration. She kept glancing toward the saddlebag hanging beside Dusty. Not greedily, desperately, like her body couldn't stop looking at food anymore. Wyatt slowly stood up again and looked toward the horizon. The temperature was dropping fast. Another hour, and the plains would freeze hard after sunset. He rubbed a tired hand over his face before reaching for the saddlebag. The girl watched every movement in silence. Wyatt opened the cloth carefully and stared down at the half loaf of bread and the strip of smoked beef inside. That was everything he had left. Everything. His stomach twisted the second the cold air touched the food. For a long moment, he didn't move at all. Then the little girl quietly whispered. Something that nearly disappeared beneath the wind. You look hungry too. Wyatt swallowed once. Hard. The corners of his weathered face tightened slightly as he looked back at her trembling hands beneath the wagon. And for the first time all day, the cold didn't feel like the worst thing waiting for him after dark. Wyatt kept staring at the food inside the saddlebag, while the little girl waited beneath the wagon without saying another word. The wind carried the smell of dust and old wood across the empty roadside, and somewhere far away a loose metal sign creaked over and over again. Dusty shifted impatiently behind him, probably hoping the bag would finally open for supper. Wyatt slowly reached inside and pulled out the strip of smoked beef first. His fingers tightened around it for half a second before he crouched near the wagon again. The girl looked at the food as though she could not believe it was real. "Take it," Wyatt said quietly. She hesitated. "I can pay you back later." Wyatt almost laughed at that, but the sound never came. The child looked too serious to laugh at. Instead, he held the meat out closer. "Eat before the cold gets worse." Her trembling fingers carefully took the strip from his hand. She did not grab it greedily like starving people usually did. That was the part that unsettled Wyatt most. She held it gently, almost politely, before taking tiny bites that looked painfully slow. Like her stomach had forgotten how to eat properly. Wyatt watched her chew for several seconds while the freezing wind tugged at the ends of his coat. "What is your name?" he finally asked. The little girl swallowed carefully before answering. "Clara." "Clara what?" Her eyes dropped again. "Just Clara." Wyatt nodded once, though he knew that was not the truth. Children traveling alone almost always hid something. Sometimes fear, sometimes shame, sometimes both. He sat down on an old crate beside the wagon and removed the half loaf of bread from the cloth wrapping. The bread felt hard enough to break a tooth. He stared at it for a long moment before tearing off a small piece and handing the larger half toward Clara. "No," she whispered immediately. "That is yours. Not anymore." Clara looked at him carefully then, as if trying to understand why a stranger would say something like that. Wyatt could see how thin her face really was now that she had crawled closer to the fading daylight. Her coat hung loose around her small shoulders, and the sleeves were too long for her hands. Somebody had probably bought it years ago for another child. She accepted the bread slowly and held it close to her chest before eating. Wyatt placed the tiny piece he kept for himself back into the bag instead of eating it. Clara noticed. "You should eat too. I already did earlier." The lie came easily. Too easily. Clara studied his face with tired blue eyes that looked older than they should have. "My father used to say people touch their stomach when they lie about being hungry." Wyatt immediately removed his hand from his abdomen without realizing he had placed it there. For the first time, Clara gave the faintest little smile. It barely lasted a second before exhaustion swallowed it again. The sun dipped lower behind the plains, painting the frozen land in dark orange light. Temperatures dropped fast out there once evening settled in. Wyatt looked around at the abandoned fields and broken fence lines nearby. There was no shelter except the wagon itself. "You planning to stay here tonight?" he asked. Clara nodded weakly. "I stayed here last night too. In this cold." It was warmer under the blanket. Wyatt glanced at the thin fabric wrapped around her knees and frowned deeply. Even Dusty had thicker protection against winter weather. He stood and walked toward his horse, reaching into another side pouch for the old canteen. Only a few swallows remained. He handed it to Clara without speaking. She drank carefully, like she had learned not to waste anything. A small amount spilled down her chin because her hands would not stop shaking. Wyatt noticed dirt smudged across her cheek where tears had probably dried hours ago. "How long since you ate before today?" he asked. Clara looked embarrassed by the question. "I do not remember exactly." Wyatt stared at the frozen ground in silence. Most grown men would not survive long out there without food. Yet somehow this tiny girl had been hiding beneath a broken wagon alone. A sharp gust of wind swept across the plains, making Clara curl tighter beneath the blanket. Wyatt looked toward the darkening road ahead again. 6 more miles to town, maybe farther with the snow clouds moving in. He could still leave now and reach shelter before midnight if he rode hard enough. But when he turned back toward Clara, he noticed something that made his chest tighten unexpectedly. She was staring at the empty saddlebag, not because she wanted more food, because she knew there was no food left inside it anymore. And somehow that seemed to bother her more than her own hunger. Wyatt did not sleep at all that night. He sat beside the dying fire with his arms folded tightly against the cold while snow gathered slowly across the shoulders of his flannel shirt. The little warmth left in the flames barely reached him anymore, but every time he looked beneath the wagon and saw Clara shivering under his coat, he forced himself to feed another handful of brittle weeds into the fire anyway. The storm deepened after midnight. Wind swept across the plains hard enough to whistle through the cracks in the broken wagon boards, carrying sharp ice through the darkness. Dusty stood with his back turned against the gusts, head lowered patiently beneath the falling snow. Wyatt rubbed his hands together again, trying to force feeling back into his fingers. Hunger had settled into something duller now. Not pain exactly. More like weakness spreading slowly through his arms and legs. He had known that feeling before too. Clara suddenly stirred beneath the blankets with a soft sound that made Wyatt look over immediately. Her face twisted uneasily against the rolled bedroll beneath her. "Mama," she whispered faintly. Wyatt stayed still. Clara's breathing quickened as fever carried her somewhere far from the frozen roadside. "Mama, I tried." Her voice cracked weakly. "I was coming back." Wyatt looked down at the fire without speaking. The little girl's hands trembled harder beneath the blanket, while snow hissed softly against the burning wood. "Do not leave me there," she whispered next. The words came out so small they barely sounded human anymore. Wyatt clenched his jaw tightly for a moment. He had heard soldiers talk in their sleep after bad nights around campfires years ago. Fear always sounded younger in the dark. Clara coughed suddenly, hard enough to force her halfway awake. Wyatt moved beside her immediately and helped steady the blanket around her shoulders. Her skin looked pale beneath the fever, almost glowing under the weak firelight. "Easy," he said quietly. Clara blinked slowly up at him, confused for a moment like she had forgotten where she was. "Did I wake you?" she whispered. Wyatt almost smiled despite himself. "Kid, I do not think anybody could sleep through this wind." Clara looked toward the snow blowing across the road beyond him. "It is prettier when you are inside somewhere warm." Wyatt glanced toward the empty plains around them. "Yeah, usually is." Clara pulled the blanket tighter. "My mother used to make hot soup whenever it snowed." Wyatt felt something tighten painfully in his stomach again, though this time it had nothing to do with hunger. Clara stared into the fire quietly after speaking, as though she could still see the memory somewhere inside the flames. "Chicken soup," she whispered softly. "With carrots." Wyatt swallowed once and looked away toward the dark horizon. He could practically smell warm broth just hearing the words. Hunger became crueler when people described food out loud. Clara noticed him staring off silently. "I am sorry," she said quickly. "I should not talk about food." Wyatt shook his head. "You can talk about whatever you want." But the truth was his stomach cramped so sharply after that conversation, he had to press his forearm against it again. He had not eaten in nearly 2 full days now. The cold only made it worse. Clara watched him carefully for a moment before quietly reaching beneath the blanket. Wyatt frowned as she pulled something tiny from her coat pocket. Half a cracker. Broken and stale. Probably forgotten there for days. She held it out toward him with trembling fingers. "You should have this." Wyatt stared at the tiny piece of food in silence. The thing barely weighed. Anything at all. Still, his stomach reacted instantly at the sight of it. Clara noticed. "Please," she whispered. "You gave me everything." Wyatt looked at the cracker for another second before gently closing her fingers around it again. "Keep it for morning." Clara lowered her hand slowly. "There might not be morning if I stay sick." Wyatt's eyes shifted sharply toward her. Clara looked embarrassed immediately after saying it aloud, but neither of them pretended the thought had not crossed their minds already. The wind roared harder through the plains, shaking loose snow from the wagon roof above them. Wyatt stood abruptly and walked several steps away into the darkness, running one tired hand across his face. He stared toward the distant horizon where faint lights from the nearest town barely flickered through the storm. Too far to reach safely tonight. Maybe not tomorrow either if Clara's fever worsened. Wyatt looked back toward the wagon and saw her curled beneath his coat, trying not to cough again because she probably thought it bothered him. That hurt more than the wind somehow. He walked back slowly and crouched beside her once more. "Listen to me," he said quietly. Clara looked up at him with tired blue eyes. "Tomorrow morning we head for town. What if they do not help?" Wyatt glanced toward the fading fire beside them. "Then I keep looking until somebody does." Clara studied his face carefully, as if trying to decide whether she believed him. Then another violent shiver ran through her tiny body despite all the blankets. Wyatt immediately pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. And when he touched her forehead again, the fever felt even hotter than before. Morning arrived gray and bitterly cold across the Wyoming plains. Snow covered the road in uneven patches while weak sunlight pushed through heavy clouds that still hung low over the land. Wyatt's fire had burned out hours earlier, leaving only black ash beneath the wagon. He stood beside Dusty, tightening the saddle straps with stiff fingers that barely felt attached to his hands anymore. Hunger had settled deep into his body now, draining strength from every movement. Even climbing into the saddle made his muscles ache. Clara coughed weakly beneath the blankets while Wyatt rolled up the bedroll behind the saddle. Her fever had not broken. If anything, her face looked paler than the night before. Wyatt walked back toward her and crouched carefully. "Can you stand?" Clara nodded, even though she clearly could not. She tried anyway, pushing herself up with trembling arms before nearly collapsing after 2 steps. Wyatt caught her gently before she hit the frozen ground. The little girl looked embarrassed immediately. "I am sorry. Kid, stop apologizing for being sick." Wyatt lifted her carefully onto Dusty's back and wrapped his coat tighter around her small shoulders. The horse shifted slowly beneath the extra weight, but remained calm. Clara looked exhausted, just sitting upright. "How far is town?" she asked quietly. Wyatt glanced down the snowy road ahead. "About 6 miles. Clara swallowed nervously. "That sounds far. Not if Dusty behaves himself." Wyatt tried to sound calmer than he felt. Truthfully, 6 miles through snow with no food and a sick child already felt longer than 50. They started down the road slowly while cold wind swept across the plains in sharp bursts. Dusty's hooves crunched through thin ice and frozen dirt as the abandoned wagon disappeared behind them. Clara held the saddle horn weakly with both hands while Wyatt walked beside the horse instead of riding. He needed to save Dusty's strength in case Clara became worse. The town finally appeared nearly 2 hours later through drifting snow and morning fog. A small cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by muddy streets and tired fences. Smoke curled from chimneys while wagons lined the main road outside stores and saloons. To Wyatt, the sight of town usually meant warmth, food, and rest. Today it only meant hope. Dangerous thing, hope. Clara stared quietly at the buildings while they entered town. People noticed them immediately. A few men standing outside the general store glanced toward Wyatt with guarded expressions before returning to their conversations. An older woman carrying laundry paused long enough to stare at Clara's pale face before hurrying inside without a word. Wyatt guided Dusty toward a small diner near the center of town where warm light glowed through the frosted windows. The smell hit him before he even reached the door. Fresh bread, bacon grease, coffee, real food. His empty stomach cramped so hard he nearly stopped walking. Clara noticed his expression immediately. "You should eat first," she whispered weakly. Wyatt ignored the comment and pushed open the diner door. Warmth wrapped around them instantly, along with the sound of silverware and quiet conversation. Several people looked up at once. Wyatt removed his hat slowly while Clara remained slumped weakly on the horse outside the window. A heavy-set woman behind the counter frowned slightly. "You buying something?" Wyatt glanced toward Clara through the glass before answering. "Little girl outside is sick. She needs hot soup and maybe a doctor." The woman's expression changed from concern to hesitation almost immediately. "You got money?" Wyatt reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins. Barely enough for anything. The woman looked down at them and sighed. "Soup costs more than that." Wyatt stared at the coins in silence for a moment. He could practically smell the broth simmering behind the counter now. His hands tightened slightly around the tiny amount of money left to his name. "Then just bring a small bowl," he said quietly. Before the woman could answer, a man near the corner table spoke without even looking up from his coffee. "Town already has enough beggars this winter." The diner fell awkwardly quiet after that. Wyatt slowly turned his head toward the voice. Middle-aged rancher. Clean coat. Full plate of eggs sitting untouched in front of him. The man finally glanced up and shrugged casually. "Not my problem if every drifter with a sad story wanders through town." Clara coughed weakly outside the window. The sound cut through the silence sharper than shouting would have. Wyatt looked back toward her pale face beyond the frosted glass. The heavy-set woman behind the counter shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe try the church on the east side," she muttered quietly. "Sometimes they help folks." Wyatt nodded once, even though disappointment settled heavily behind his eyes. He picked the coins back up slowly from the counter. His stomach twisted painfully again as the smell of hot food filled the room around him. For one dangerous second, he almost spent the money on bread instead. Almost. Then Clara coughed again outside in the cold, and Wyatt quietly placed the coins back into his pocket before walking toward the door. As he stepped outside into the freezing wind again, he heard the rancher mutter one last thing behind him. "Man looks hungrier than the kid." And the worst part was that he was right. The church on the east side of town turned out to be smaller than Wyatt expected. White paint peeled from the wooden walls, and snow had gathered thick along the steps leading to the front door. A crooked cross leaned above the entrance while weak yellow light glowed through the windows. Wyatt helped Clara down from Dusty carefully, noticing immediately how little strength remained in her legs. She leaned against him without meaning to, her body burning with fever beneath his coat. "Can you walk?" he asked softly. Clara nodded automatically again, though her knees nearly gave out after the first step. Wyatt placed one steady hand against her shoulder and guided her slowly toward the church doors. Warm air met them inside along with the smell of old wood and candle wax. The room was nearly empty except for a gray-haired pastor sweeping near the front pews. He looked up immediately when he saw Clara. "Lord above," the man whispered, setting the broom aside. Wyatt removed his hat respectfully. "She needs warmth. Maybe soup if you have any." The pastor hurried forward without hesitation and gently touched Clara's forehead. Concern filled his tired face instantly. "This child should be in bed." "That would be nice," Wyatt answered quietly. The pastor led them toward a small back room near the kitchen where a tiny stove glowed with heat. Clara sat slowly in a wooden chair while the pastor poured steaming water into a kettle. The smell alone nearly weakened Wyatt's knees. Real warmth. Real food somewhere nearby. Clara looked half asleep already as the pastor wrapped another blanket around her shoulders. "I can make broth," the old man said softly. "Nothing fancy, but warm." Wyatt nodded once. "Thank you." The pastor studied him carefully then, his eyes lingering on Wyatt's pale face and tired posture. "You look like you could use some too." Wyatt forced a small shrug. "Kid comes first." The old man disappeared briefly into the kitchen area while Clara rested beside the stove. Her cheeks were flushed from fever now, and every few breaths ended with another rough cough. Wyatt crouched beside the firewood pile to warm his stiff hands, though even the heat made him feel strangely lightheaded. Hunger had become something heavier now, slower, like his body was running out of things to burn. Clara noticed him staring into the stove flames. "You should eat this time," she whispered weakly. Wyatt looked over. "You planning to boss me around forever?" Clara gave the faintest little smile before coughing again. A few minutes later, the pastor returned carrying 2 bowls of thin broth and small pieces of bread on cracked ceramic plates. The smell nearly crushed Wyatt where he sat. His stomach twisted violently the second the food touched the table. Clara reached for her spoon slowly with trembling hands while Wyatt kept staring at his own untouched bowl. Steam curled upward into the warm little room. The pastor quietly pulled another chair beside them. "Winter has been hard this year," he said softly. "Too many folks passing through with nothing left." Wyatt nodded absent-mindedly, still staring at the bread. The crust looked soft, fresh, probably baked that morning. He realized suddenly how badly his hands were shaking. Clara noticed too. She pushed her own plate slightly toward him. "You can have some of mine." Wyatt immediately shook his head. "Eat." Clara lowered her eyes again and obeyed quietly, sipping the broth in tiny, careful swallows. Wyatt finally lifted his spoon after watching her eat first. The warm liquid hit his stomach like fire after 2 days without real food. For a moment, he closed his eyes completely. Just one spoonful made him realize how close to collapse he had actually become. The pastor pretended not to notice. "There is a doctor 2 streets over," the old man said after a while. "Good man, but he charges." Wyatt looked up slowly. "How much?" The pastor hesitated just long enough for Wyatt to understand the answer would hurt. "More than soup costs." Silence settled heavily in the room after that. Clara kept eating quietly while Wyatt reached into his coat pocket again, counting the same useless coins beneath his fingers. Not enough. Not even close. His eyes drifted toward the silver spurs attached to his boots. Old. Scratched. One of the last decent things he still owned. The pastor followed his gaze immediately. "You should not have to sell what little you have left." Wyatt gave a tired smile that never reached his eyes. "Funny thing about hunger and fever," he muttered. "They usually do not care what a man should have to do." An hour later, Clara had fallen asleep beside the stove, curled beneath blankets, while weak snow continued falling outside the church windows. Wyatt stood quietly near the entrance, fastening his coat again. The pastor approached him softly. "Where are you going?" Wyatt looked down at the silver spurs on his boots before answering. "To see what they are worth." The old man frowned. "In this weather?" Wyatt glanced back once toward Clara sleeping by the fire. She needs medicine before morning. He stepped outside into the freezing wind again, pulling the church door shut behind him. Snow drifted across the empty street, while warm light glowed softly through the windows at his back. Wyatt stood there for a moment staring at the dark town ahead, then slowly bent down and began unfastening the silver spurs from his boots. Wyatt stood outside the church for a long moment with snow collecting slowly on his shoulders while he held the silver spurs in his hands. They were heavier than they looked. Old, polished metal that had once meant pride now felt like a reminder of how little he actually owned. The wind cut through his coat immediately, and for the first time that night, he wished he had kept them just for the warmth they might bring when strapped to his boots. He tightened his grip and began walking down the empty street. The town was quieter now than it had been earlier, most windows dark except for a few dim lights flickering behind frosted glass. Snow crunched under his boots as he made his way toward the only place still open this late, a small trading post near the edge of town. The sign above the door swayed slightly in the wind, barely readable beneath a layer of ice. Inside, the air smelled of tobacco, old leather, and burned coffee. A man behind the counter looked up when Wyatt entered, his expression shifting immediately to cautious interest. "You here to sell something?" Wyatt opened his hand slowly and placed the silver spurs on the counter. The man picked them up, turning them under the lamplight. "These are decent," he said after a moment. "Old craftsmanship. Real silver tips." Wyatt said nothing. His jaw was tight, his hands still stiff from the cold outside. The man studied him for another second. "What do you need them for?" Wyatt glanced briefly toward the door, as if expecting to see Clara standing there. "Medicine," he said quietly. "For a child." The trader's expression softened just slightly, but did not fully change. "Doctors in this town do not work cheap." Wyatt nodded once. "I know." The man placed the spurs back on the counter and reached under it, pulling out a small pouch of coins and a wrapped bundle of medical supplies. "Fever tonic, basic antibiotics, and something for the cough," he said. "It is still not enough value for the spurs." Wyatt stared at the items in silence for a long moment. His stomach tightened again, reminding him he had not eaten since the night before last. The smell of food from earlier still lingered in his memory, faint but cruel. Finally, he slid the spurs forward. "Take them anyway." The trader hesitated. "You sure?" Wyatt did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the counter as if it might give him another option. It did not. "I am sure," he said at last. The exchange was done quickly after that. The man handed him the medicine and coin pouch, wrapping everything in a small cloth bag. Wyatt turned to leave, but the trader spoke again before he reached the door. "That girl must mean a lot to you." Wyatt paused with his hand on the doorframe. Snow swirled inside every time the wind pushed it open slightly. He did not look back when he answered. "She does not need to mean anything," he said quietly. "She just needs help." Then he stepped back into the cold night. The walk back to the church felt longer than before. The snow had grown heavier, turning the streets into pale shadows under weak lamplight. Wyatt kept one hand inside his coat, holding the medicine tightly as if it might disappear if he loosened his grip. Hunger clawed at him harder now that the adrenaline of the trade had faded. His legs felt slower, heavier, but he kept moving. When he finally reached the church steps again, the warm light spilling through the windows felt like another world entirely. Inside, Clara was still asleep near the stove, her small chest rising and falling unevenly beneath the blankets. The pastor looked up as Wyatt entered. "You got it." Wyatt placed the cloth bundle on the table without speaking. The pastor immediately began unpacking it, relief visible in his expression when he saw the medicine. "This should help," he said quietly. Wyatt nodded but did not sit down. Instead, he walked straight toward Clara. Her face looked calmer than earlier, though still flushed with fever. He gently placed the back of his hand against her forehead again. Still hot, but not worsening. The pastor prepared a small dose of tonic while Wyatt crouched beside Clara. Her eyes fluttered slightly, opening just enough to recognize him. "Did you find food?" she whispered weakly. Wyatt hesitated for half a second. Then he shook his head. "Not yet." Clara looked like she wanted to say something more, but the pastor gently helped her drink the medicine instead. She swallowed slowly, then sank back into the blankets again. Wyatt stood up and finally allowed himself to sit in the chair beside her. His body felt heavier than it had all day. The warmth of the church wrapped around him, but it did not reach the deeper exhaustion inside him. For a moment, he simply watched Clara breathe. Outside, snow continued falling over the quiet town, covering the streets, the wagons, and everything else in a soft white silence. And for the first time since he found her under that broken wagon, Wyatt Mercer realized he might not be able to leave her side until she was safe. The night outside the church had grown deeper and quieter, as if the entire town had slowed its breathing beneath the weight of falling snow. Inside, the warmth from the small stove held steady, but Wyatt Mercer could still feel the cold clinging to his bones in a way that did not fully fade. He sat in the wooden chair beside Clara Whitmore, watching her small chest rise and fall with a fragile rhythm that made every second feel heavier than the last. The medicine had helped slightly. Her breathing was less sharp now, less strained, but the fever still lingered beneath her skin like a fire that refused to go out. The pastor had fallen asleep in a chair near the doorway, exhausted from the long night of care. The church was quiet except for the faint crackle of burning wood and the soft sound of wind pressing against the windows. Wyatt kept his coat folded over Clara, though he no longer had the strength to feel warmth himself. Hunger had become something constant now, not sharp like before but dull and endless, like a weight tied inside his stomach. He stared at the small table across from him where the empty medicine pouch sat. The silver spurs were gone now. He could still feel their absence more than he could remember their weight. Clara stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open again. "Are you still here?" she whispered weakly. Wyatt leaned forward a little. "I am still here." She nodded faintly, as if that answer alone was enough to calm her. "It feels warmer now." "That is the medicine," Wyatt said softly. Clara closed her eyes again, but did not fully fall asleep. Instead, she spoke in a slow, tired voice. "My father used to say storms feel smaller when someone stays with you through them." Wyatt did not answer right away. The words settled in the quiet room between them, heavier than the cold outside. He looked down at his hands resting on his knees. They were still shaking slightly, though he was not sure if it was from exhaustion or hunger anymore. "Your father was right," he finally said. Clara gave a faint sound that might have been agreement. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing snow against the church walls in soft waves. Wyatt stood slowly and walked toward the small kitchen area behind the main room. There was nothing left there except an empty kettle and a few dry pieces of wood. He checked anyway out of habit, opening cabinets that only held dust and old ceramic cups. Nothing useful. He leaned against the counter for a moment, closing his eyes briefly. His body felt slower now, like it was running out of fuel in small invisible steps. When he returned to Clara, she was watching him again. "You did not eat," she said quietly. Wyatt gave a tired half nod. "I will. You always say that." He almost smiled at that, though it never fully formed. Instead, he sat back down beside her. Clara shifted slightly beneath the coat and reached toward his sleeve with weak fingers. "You should sleep," she whispered. "I am not going anywhere," Wyatt answered. Clara looked at him for a long moment, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but still alert in a childlike way that noticed everything. "Why are you doing all of this?" she asked again, softer than before. The same question returned, but this time it felt harder to avoid. Wyatt stared at the fire for several seconds before speaking. "Because I know what it is like when nobody stops," he said quietly. Clara did not respond immediately. She seemed to accept the answer, even if she did not fully understand it. Her fingers loosened from his sleeve and fell back onto the blanket. Outside, a distant bell rang somewhere in town, marking the late hour. The sound echoed faintly through the church walls before fading into silence again. Wyatt shifted in his chair, trying to ignore the growing weakness in his body. The warmth of the room made him feel heavier, not lighter, like his strength was finally catching up with how much he had lost. Clara's breathing became steadier again, and her face relaxed slightly as the fever eased. For the first time since he found her, she looked almost peaceful. Wyatt stayed still, watching over her without moving. Hours passed slowly in that quiet room. Snow continued falling outside, covering the world beyond the church in white silence. And somewhere deep in Wyatt Mercer's exhausted mind, a simple thought settled in without warning. He was no longer just passing through this town. Not anymore. Morning arrived with a pale gray light pressing against the church windows, soft and uncertain like the world itself was still deciding whether to fully wake up. Wyatt Mercer had not slept. He remained in the same wooden chair beside Clara Whitmore, his posture slightly leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the small rise and fall of her breathing. The night had stretched long and uneven, but the fever had finally started to ease sometime before dawn. Her skin was still warm, but no longer burning the way it had the day before. That small change alone felt like a victory Wyatt did not know how to celebrate. The pastor had already left early in the morning to tend to other duties in town, leaving only silence, warmth from the fading stove, and the quiet presence of falling snow outside. Wyatt slowly stood and stretched his stiff shoulders. Every movement felt heavier than it should have. Hunger had turned into a constant, dull pressure now, like something living inside him that refused to go away. He walked toward the small kitchen area again, opening the cabinet doors out of habit even though he already knew there would be nothing inside. Empty shelves, cold wood, dust in the corners. He closed them again slowly and leaned against the counter for a moment, breathing out through his nose. Clara stirred behind him. "Are you awake?" she asked softly. Wyatt turned immediately and walked back toward her. "I have been awake." Clara's eyes opened halfway. She looked weaker than yesterday, but more present. "It is morning." "Yes," Wyatt said. She tried to sit up slightly but stopped halfway, her small hands gripping the blanket for support. Wyatt stepped closer and helped her ease back down. "Do not rush," he said quietly. Clara nodded faintly, then looked around the church as if trying to understand where she was for a moment before remembering. "The soup lady is gone?" she asked. Wyatt almost smiled at the way she described the pastor's help. "She is not a soup lady," he said. "But yes, she is gone for now." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Did you eat last night?" Wyatt paused slightly before answering. "Not really." Clara frowned weakly, as if she already knew the answer before hearing it. "You are lying again." Wyatt exhaled slowly. "Maybe a little." Clara looked toward the stove where only cold ashes remained. "I feel better," she said softly, almost as if she was testing the words. "But I am still tired." "That is normal," Wyatt replied. He reached for the small cloth bundle of remaining supplies and checked it again. The medicine was almost gone, only enough for another small dose if needed. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the church walls, carrying snow that had begun to settle more slowly than before. The storm was easing, but the cold remained sharp and deep. Wyatt walked to the window and looked out over the town. People were beginning to move again in the streets. Wagons creaked, doors opened, smoke rose from chimneys. Life continuing as if nothing unusual had happened the night before. He turned back when Clara spoke again. "Where will we go today?" Wyatt hesitated for a moment. That question had been sitting in the back of his mind since last night. "Somewhere warmer," he said finally. Clara nodded slowly. "Will you stay with me until then?" Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. The answer was already clear to him, even before he spoke it. "Yes," he said. Clara seemed satisfied with that response and closed her eyes again, though not fully asleep. Wyatt returned to the chair beside her and sat down carefully. His body felt slower now, like even standing took effort he did not fully have. Hunger was no longer just discomfort. It was beginning to feel like emptiness spreading through everything. A soft knock came at the church door a short time later. Wyatt stood immediately and opened it. A young man from town stood outside, holding a wrapped loaf of bread and a small container of milk. "Pastor said this might help," the man said quietly. Wyatt stared at the food for a moment before taking it carefully. "Thank you." The man nodded once and left without another word. Wyatt closed the door and stood there for a second, holding the bread in his hands. Clara had already noticed. Her eyes followed him immediately. Wyatt broke off a small piece and handed it to her first. "Eat." Clara hesitated. "You first." "We are not doing that again," Wyatt said softly. Clara accepted the piece and began eating slowly. Only then did Wyatt take a bite himself. The taste was simple, plain, but it felt like strength returning in small fragments. He closed his eyes briefly as he chewed. When he opened them again, Clara was watching him carefully. "You look different," she said. Wyatt raised an eyebrow slightly. "Different how?" Clara thought for a moment. "Less tired." Wyatt gave a quiet, tired smile. "Food helps with that." Clara nodded as if that was important information she intended to remember. Outside, the town was now fully awake. The storm had passed completely, leaving a bright but cold morning behind. Snow still covered everything, but the air felt clearer. Wyatt looked out the window again, this time with a different kind of focus. We might be able to move soon, he said. Clara sat up a little more this time. Where? Wyatt looked back at her. Somewhere you can stay safe. Clara seemed to consider that carefully. Then she asked the question that lingered between them both. What about you? Wyatt did not answer immediately. He simply looked at her for a long moment while the morning light slowly filled the church behind them. And for the first time since he met her, he realized the hardest part of the journey was not behind them yet. The morning light had fully settled over the town by the time Wyatt Mercer and Clara Whitmore stepped out of the church. The snow from the night before now sparkled faintly under a cold but steady sun, covering the streets, rooftops, and wagon wheels in a clean white layer that made everything look quieter than it really was. Clara stood close to Wyatt, holding onto his coat with one small hand as they moved slowly down the church steps. Her steps were steadier than yesterday, but still weak, each one carefully placed as if the ground itself might disappear beneath her. Wyatt kept his pace slow so she would not have to rush. The medicine had helped. The fever was no longer burning through her body, but exhaustion still lingered in her face like something she could not shake off completely. He adjusted his coat around her shoulders again as they reached the bottom of the steps. We are going to find you something warm to wear, he said quietly. Clara nodded without looking up at him. And food? She asked. Wyatt paused for a fraction of a second before answering. Yes. The word came out more certain than he felt. The truth was he had very little left, and even less idea of how long they could stay in town before things became complicated again. But Clara did not need uncertainty. She needed direction. They walked through the main street slowly, passing by stores beginning to open for the day. Shopkeepers swept porches, wagons rolled past carrying supplies, and voices mixed with the sound of boots on frozen ground. A few people glanced at them, recognizing the same sick child from the day before, but most continued on without stopping. Wyatt led Clara toward a small general store at the corner of the street. The bell above the door rang softly when they entered, and warm air immediately replaced the cold outside. Clara let out a small breath as she stepped inside. The store was modest but orderly, shelves lined with fabric, food supplies, and basic clothing. A middle-aged woman behind the counter looked up and immediately recognized them. You again, she said. Wyatt nodded once. She needs something warmer than what she has. The woman studied Clara for a moment before stepping out from behind the counter. She looks better than yesterday. She is, Wyatt replied. Clara stood quietly while the woman picked through a stack of folded clothes near the back. After a few minutes, she returned with a simple wool coat and a pair of gloves. This should fit, she said. Wyatt helped Clara try them on carefully. The coat was slightly large, but it wrapped around her small frame warmly enough to make her sigh in relief. The gloves covered her thin fingers completely. She looked down at them as if she was not used to having anything that fit her properly. Thank you, she whispered. The woman behind the counter nodded. Children should not be walking around in weather like this. Wyatt reached into his pocket and placed what remained of his coins on the counter. It was barely enough, but the woman accepted it without argument. There is also soup in the back, she added after a pause. Not much, but it is hot. Clara looked up at Wyatt immediately. He gave a small nod. We will take it. They sat together near the back of the store while Clara slowly ate a small bowl of warm soup. Her hands were steadier now, and the color had begun to return faintly to her face. Wyatt did not eat immediately. He simply watched her for a moment, making sure she was actually holding the food down without difficulty. Only after she had finished half the bowl did he take a few careful spoonfuls himself. The warmth settled into his stomach in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after days of emptiness. Clara leaned slightly against the wooden bench while she ate. Are we staying here today? She asked. Wyatt shook his head slightly. Not long. Just enough to make sure you are strong enough to travel. Clara considered that quietly. Where are we traveling to? Wyatt looked down at his hands for a moment before answering. Somewhere you do not have to hide under broken wagons. Clara did not respond immediately. Instead, she focused on the soup again, eating slower now. Outside the window, the town moved at its normal pace. Life continued as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside the small store, something had shifted between them. Not comfort exactly, but direction. After finishing the soup, Wyatt stood and helped Clara back into her coat. They stepped outside again into the cold air, but it felt less harsh than before. The sun was higher now, casting longer light across the snow-covered streets. Clara walked beside him more steadily this time, her hand no longer gripping his coat as tightly. "You are still coming with me, right?" she asked suddenly. Wyatt glanced down at her. "Yes." Clara nodded once, satisfied with the answer. They walked in silence for a while, moving toward the edge of town where the roads opened back into wide, empty plains. The wind was lighter now, but the cold still remained. Wyatt looked ahead at the long stretch of road disappearing into white distance. He knew what waited out there was uncertain. He knew he had nothing left to sell, no clear plan, and no guarantee of what tomorrow would bring. But when Clara's small steps matched his beside him, steadying with each passing moment, he realized something simple but important. Leaving her now was no longer an option he was willing to consider. The road outside town stretched long and silent beneath a pale winter sky, fading into rolling fields of white that seemed endless in every direction. Wyatt Mercer walked beside Clara Whitmore as they left the last line of buildings behind them, their footprints marking the only signs of life across the frozen ground. Clara held tightly to the edge of her new coat, her steps more stable now but still careful, as if the world might shift unexpectedly beneath her. Wyatt carried nothing except his worn hat, his coat, and the small remaining supplies they had managed to keep. Hunger had returned again, not as sharply as before, but steady and draining, like a quiet weight that refused to leave his body. The farther they moved from town, the quieter everything became. No voices, no wagons, only the sound of wind brushing across open land. Clara looked up at him after a long stretch of silence. "Are we far enough yet?" she asked. Wyatt shook his head slightly. "Not yet." She nodded and continued walking without complaint. Hours passed slowly as they followed the old dirt road that cut through the plains. The sun rose higher but offered little warmth. Snow still clung to patches of grass and frozen soil, and every gust of wind carried a bite that cut through even thick clothing. Clara began to slow again after a while, her steps growing uneven. Wyatt noticed immediately and gently guided her to a stop beside a cluster of rocks near the roadside. "Rest for a moment," he said quietly. She sat carefully, pulling her knees close while Wyatt stood nearby scanning the horizon. There was nothing in sight except open land and distant tree lines. No town, no smoke, no sign of shelter. Clara leaned back slightly against the rocks. "Do you think we will find somewhere warm before night?" Wyatt hesitated before answering. "We will find something." Clara studied him for a moment. "You always say that." Wyatt gave a faint, tired smile. "Because it is usually true." After a short rest, they continued forward. The wind began to pick up again, carrying colder air across the plains. Wyatt adjusted his coat tighter and kept close to Clara, making sure she did not drift too far behind. As the afternoon faded, dark clouds began gathering in the distance. Heavy, slow-moving shapes that promised another storm. Wyatt watched them carefully. Storms in this part of the country could turn dangerous quickly, especially without shelter. By late afternoon, Clara's steps had slowed again. Her energy was fading despite the earlier rest. Wyatt scanned the horizon more urgently now, searching for anything that could offer cover. That was when he saw it. A small structure in the distance, half hidden behind a line of bare trees. A weathered wooden cabin, likely abandoned, sitting just off the main road. Wyatt pointed gently. "There." Clara followed his gaze. "Is it safe?" "Safe enough for the night," he said. They moved toward it quickly as the wind began to rise again. Snow started falling in thin, scattered flakes that grew heavier with each passing minute. By the time they reached the cabin, the storm was beginning to settle in. The door creaked when Wyatt pushed it open. Inside, the air was cold but sheltered from the wind. Dust covered the wooden floor, and a small fireplace sat empty in the corner. It was not much, but it was enough. Wyatt guided Clara inside first, helping her sit near the hearth before inspecting the space. No signs of recent occupation. No food. No supplies. Only shelter. He stepped outside briefly to gather dry wood from a nearby stack of fallen branches and returned quickly before the snow could worsen. Soon a small fire was burning, weak at first, but growing steady enough to push back the cold. Clara watched the flames quietly, her face reflecting soft, orange light. "It feels like a different world in here," she said. Wyatt nodded as he sat beside her. "That is what fires do." Clara pulled her coat tighter. "Will we stay here tomorrow too?" Wyatt looked into the fire for a moment. Only until the storm passes. Silence settled between them again, but it was no longer empty. The sound of wind outside grew louder as snow began to cover the cabin walls. Inside, the fire gave them a small circle of warmth against the growing cold. Wyatt leaned back slightly, exhaustion finally catching up with him now that they had stopped moving. Clara shifted closer without thinking, resting lightly against his side. Wyatt did not move away. For a long moment, he simply watched the fire burn lower while the storm strengthened outside. He knew there was still a long road ahead, longer than anything behind them. But for now, inside the small wooden cabin, with a child finally warm beside him and a fire still holding against the cold, Wyatt Mercer allowed himself one quiet thought he had not dared to admit before. They might actually make it through the winter. The storm had passed overnight, leaving the world outside the cabin buried under a thick, untouched blanket of snow. Morning light filtered through the wooden cracks in pale lines, soft and cold, turning the inside of the cabin into a quiet space suspended between warmth and winter. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, still giving off just enough heat to keep the air from freezing completely. Wyatt Mercer sat near the fireplace, his back against the rough wooden wall, watching the last small pieces of wood collapse into ash. Clara Whitmore was still asleep beside him, curled under his coat and an extra blanket he had found inside the cabin the night before. Her breathing was steady now. No more fever shaking through her body. No more restless coughing. Just slow, even sleep that looked almost peaceful compared to everything she had endured. Wyatt did not move for a long time. His body felt heavy in a way that had nothing to do with tiredness alone. Hunger had become something distant now, dulled by exhaustion and silence. He looked down at his hands resting loosely on his knees. They were rough, cold, and still slightly trembling from days without enough rest or food. But they were steady enough to stay still. That mattered more than anything else at the moment. Outside, the wind had softened to a low whisper moving across the snow. The world felt still again, as if the storm had taken all its noise and left behind something quieter and heavier. Clara shifted slightly in her sleep, turning her head toward him without waking. Wyatt adjusted the coat gently over her shoulders, making sure she stayed warm. Her small fingers curled slightly into the fabric as if holding onto it without knowing. For a moment, Wyatt simply watched her. Not as someone passing through, not as someone helping temporarily, just as someone who had stayed longer than he ever intended to. A quiet thought settled in his mind, simple but undeniable. The road had not ended when they found shelter. It had only changed direction. Clara stirred again, this time waking slowly. Her eyes opened halfway, adjusting to the soft light in the cabin. "Is it morning?" she asked weakly. Wyatt nodded. "Yes." She sat up carefully, looking around as if remembering where she was. "We stayed the night." "We did," Wyatt said. Clara rubbed her eyes with small, slow movements. "I do not feel sick anymore." Wyatt studied her for a moment before answering. "That is good." She looked at him closely. "Did you sleep?" Wyatt paused. "A little." Clara seemed to accept that answer, though neither of them believed it fully. She glanced toward the dying embers in the fireplace. "It is warmer here than outside." "That is the idea," Wyatt replied softly. A long silence settled between them again, but it felt different now. Not empty, just calm. Clara pulled the blanket tighter and leaned slightly closer to the fire. "What happens after this?" she asked. Wyatt looked toward the small window where sunlight reflected off the snow outside. The world beyond was bright but uncertain. "We keep moving," he said after a moment. Clara tilted her head slightly. "Where?" Wyatt did not answer immediately. That question carried more weight than distance alone. It carried everything that came after survival, after silence, after shelter. "Somewhere better than where we started," he finally said. Clara nodded slowly, as if that was enough for now. Wyatt stood and walked to the door, opening it. Slightly, cold air rushed inside immediately, sharp against the warmth of the cabin. The snow outside was deep but still, untouched except for their tracks from the night before. The storm had passed completely. The sky above was clear now, pale blue stretching over endless white land. He stepped outside for a moment, letting the cold hit his face fully. It was the kind of cold that reminded a man he was still alive. Behind him, Clara called softly from the doorway. "Are you leaving again?" Wyatt turned back toward her. She stood wrapped in his coat, small against the bright snow behind her. He shook his head. Not without you. Clara looked relieved at that answer, though she did not say it aloud. Wyatt walked back inside and closed the door behind him, sealing the warmth in once more. He glanced around the cabin one final time. It was not home. It was not permanent, but it had been enough to carry them through the worst of the storm. Clara moved closer to the fireplace again, watching the last faint glow of embers. "We are still going, right?" she asked quietly. Wyatt nodded. "Yes." Clara smiled faintly for the first time in days. "Okay." Wyatt reached for his coat, preparing for the cold outside once more. But before he opened the door, he looked back at her again, not as a stranger, not as a responsibility, but as something he had chosen to keep walking beside. And for the first time since the journey began, the road ahead did not feel like something he was walking alone.